like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, it seems like you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. That's the wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like this old thing.
All right, Dan, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I know it's not that long ago since I was last on, and we're talking about the sort of decline and fall of Britain, and at least neither of us said anything silly like at least it can't get worse, because, you know, here we are like 6 weeks later, and all of a sudden we've got something, a meaningful reduction.
I know exactly what you mean, and genuinely, I can't wait until the day I can have you on to discuss good news. Like that will be a wonderful episode. But it seems as if every time I talk to you, or let's be honest, anyone from England, it just seems to be getting worse. And I don't say that to gloat, far from it, but to say that, you know, things are quite dire. So obviously, look, the title of the stream is talking about digital ID. This is something that they've been building to for quite some time. But do you want to start off first with the update? What has changed? What is new? And then we can dig into the background after that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what happened is Keir Starmer very recently announced that, out of nowhere, by the way. I mean, there is background to this, and this is a global rollout, and it's a plan being pushed by various international bodies, and we can go into all of that. But we thought it was essentially a dead idea in this country. And largely the reason for that is that Tony Blair, when he was in government back in the 2000s, he had tried to push it. It was a great scheme of his, and it was incredibly unpopular. And he tried for about 6 years, but just couldn't get over the insurmountable public opposition to this, because everybody could see where something like an ID scheme was going, especially with a government like that. And so it kind of disappeared from the table. And so for a long time, for the last 20 odd years, we thought that this digital ID rollout was just something that was happening in other countries. And, you know, perhaps like you may think in America, it's something that affects elsewhere. Starmer, however, is in an interesting sort of political situation. As I'm sure many of your viewers know, he did win the last election. But the only reason that he won the last election is because the Conservatives were in the process of being replaced by Nigel Farage's Reform. And at the time of the last election, the Reform were unproven. They didn't have any MPs. And so a lot of people could see that the Tories were done. But at the same time, the Tories still were the party of government at that point. And a lot of people thought, well, maybe I'm wasting my vote if I go for Reform. But Tories had been so bad in their previous spelling government, and the Boris wave and the mass immigration that they're giving us, and the COVID lockdowns and a whole bunch of other things. For a lot of people, it was intolerable carrying on with them. So the right was essentially fractured between Reform and the Tories. And this gave rise to a odd situation where Keir Starmer was able to win the last general election. But he did it with fewer the votes than the previous Labour leader had got when he lost it. So on day one, they were a very unpopular government, and then they mishandled a whole bunch of things. I mean, the most notable of these would be the massacre at a dance class where a chap from Rwanda, an immigrant, had basically pushed his way in and attacked a whole dance class of little girls. You know, we're talking sort of 6 and 7 years old. He attacked them with a machete, killing 3 of them and giving life-changing injuries to a whole bunch of them. And Keir Starmer's response to that was to basically call us all far right because we didn't like it. And jail many, many people because they expressed displeasure with that situation on Twitter and so on. Many people went to jail for that, but many people are still in jail for having expressed their displeasure at that. So Keir Starmer is in the situation where he knows that he's not going to win the next election. He knows that, I mean, he is the most unpopular prime minister we've ever had. I mean, by some margin. And it's impressive how quickly he got there, because at least with somebody like Boris Johnson, he had to bring in about 5 million people before he became unpopular. Keir Starmer managed it in the first 6 months. So he's in a rather unique political situation of knowing that he's never going to be in government ever again, but he's got 4 years left. And therefore, he can basically do whatever the hell he wants without having to worry about the political fallout from it. He has complete control for 4 years and he's going to use it. And so he's decided to bring back this old Blair plan of digital ID. Fantastically unpopular. Within a couple of days, there was a petition got together of 3 million people. We have a system in the UK where you can put a petition on the Parliament website and people can sign it. And then if it gets over 100,000 signatures, it's supposed to be debated in Parliament. Well, he got 3 million in a couple of days. And they have responded to that petition now. And they said words to the effect of, we're just going to do it. No debate is necessary. We're going to do this. And I'm heartened that so many of our, American compatriots or patriots out there have recognized the issue and want to talk about this, because if this goes ahead, it's genuinely quite worrying for the level of control that it gives the state.
Well, definitely. I think that the closest experience any of us in the US had to a digital ID was something like the COVID vaccine cards, which, look, they weren't digital. They weren't a particularly good ID. And hypothetically speaking, there were ways, if you knew a guy who owned a printer, that you could just make your own. I have never admitted to such a thing, but I know a guy who did do that. Especially comedic, because you could say you were, again, hypothetically, a 58-year-old black man and no one would bother to check, and that would be kind of funny. But in all seriousness, right, the idea that there is a sort of extra document you need to have access to, that sort of like a credit score can be edited in real time to allow you and restrict you from certain privileges. I mean, quite literally, this is what we see in China. And what's especially irritating about it is look, China may be evil, but China also seems to be relatively competent, right? Yeah, sure, they're using it to go after, dissenters, but also they're using it to go after scum, lowlifes. Not an endorsement of that plan, but you have the combination of this evil technology wielded by some of the dumbest, most malicious people in the world. And so do you want to speak about the difference between what this digital ID is billed for, like what it is supposed to be on the outside of the tin, if you will, versus what it's actually going to be used for? I think perhaps the best example, because this happened again 6 weeks ago, was the new speech laws, the new content laws, ostensibly designed to protect children from exposure to indecent material, very quickly used for something different. And so do you see a similar relationship where you're sort of being lied to about the purpose of these digital IDs with this most recent development?
Oh, that happens all the time. So back in the 2000s, when the whole issue was terrorism, Islamic terrorism, a whole bunch of Islamic terror laws were brought in at that time. And almost immediately, they were abused to the maximum possible extent by every agency of the law, down to the point where local councils were using anti-terror legislation to fine people who put the bins out on the wrong day. About as far removed from terrorism as you can possibly get. However, the law was written in such a way as that they could use that, and therefore they immediately did. So for the past couple of weeks, we've had various Labour MPs coming out and saying, well, you're giving us all of these dystopian ideas about what you think it might be used for, and come on, this is fantasy, this is dystopia. Well, we live in a country where that happens every single time a new piece of legislation comes out. It is immediately abused. It is not applied to certain people, mainly the New Britons, but it is applied to anyone who's a political enemy. So it is simply going to be used as a political tool. As for the justifications, again, that's changed over time. So when Blair was in, again, this was during the 2000s, and what everybody wanted to talk about was Islamic terrorism at the time. So the last time we got IDs muted, it was to stop terrorism. Well, they can't use that at the moment because they kind of ended up in this weird situation where they just can't talk about it, because otherwise the multicultural thing in this country is already at breaking point and they can't acknowledge it. So they just have to try and push that away. The current big talking point in the UK is the immigration. And actually our worst problem is legal immigration, the about 1 million people a year that the government lets in legally. They just let them fly in on various visas, and a lot of the time they disappear, or maybe even they're given British citizenship. It's a mad situation they're in. But what they like to focus everybody in is the small boats problem. So these are people coming across on boats from France. And the argument that Starmer has made this time, because you attach it to whatever's in the news, the argument is that if everybody in this country has a mandatory digital ID, it will stop dinghies turning up on the shores of Kent from France. And again, a whole bunch of Labour MPs have gone out and done interviews and been asked, well, how does that make any sense whatsoever? And they try and say, oh, well, it will stop them working. And it's like, well, yeah, but why do they need to work? They get given a hotel and they get given benefits. And if they do work, it's cash in hand. It's takeaway delivery. It's all that kind of stuff. Or they work for Deliveroo. And, you know, it was recently found that there was one Deliveroo driver who had farmed out his account to 200 different people simultaneously. And they're all logging in, and from Deliveroo's point of view, just must have just been the most industrious driver they had ever had, operating out of multiple different cities at the same time. So this idea that it's about illegal immigration is, of course, nonsense. But that's simply the mechanism to push it at this current time, because that happens to be the top of the news cycle, when evidently it is clearly about something else.
Well, I mean, I don't know why, Alfred the Great bothered with fighting a battle when he could have just implemented digital ID and everyone who showed up in a boat would be forced to leave, right? It's clearly absurd. And
yes,
in the US, we saw this happen with the Patriot Act, right? After 9/11, that here is a bill to make sure it never happens again, right? Never again, never forget, all of that. And even just recently, what have we seen? That those same powers, which were used to spy on President Trump, were used to spy on Republican senators, right? Elected officials at the highest levels of government, were also used to geofence anyone who went to church, right? Building a database of someone who did something that is quite literally normal, that most people do. Right? And look, I'm not some sort of libertarian on this issue. I'm not some kind of bleeding heart lib, but it is very clear that given this amount of power, the state will abuse it and will turn it particularly on who you would think would be their highest priority: productive, normal people, the citizens of their country. I'm glad you brought up the distinction between the New Britons. The term anarcho-tyranny, taken from Francis, is brought up all the time. But it is very much how our elites rule us, that these draconian laws, these incredible police powers, are never used against people who actually deserve it, who've actually done something wrong. It's done against, one, people who it's relatively easy to police. No one wants to actually do something dangerous. We've seen, and no offense to your police, the one time they had to use guns this year, what did they do? I mean, yeah, sure, they got the guy, but there were some collateral damage.
Well, so I mean, you're referring to the case of the New Britain, and I'm not making this up. I swear this is true. His name was Jihad al-Shami, so which literally translates as "Holy War from Syria." Right now, this guy came here in 2006. And somebody at the Home Office was looking at his application and looked at it and thought, okay, oh look, Holy War from Syria wants to become a British citizen. I see no problem with that, and they stamped it. And then on top of that, they then parked Holy War from Syria in Manchester, right next to the area of town with the highest Jewish population. And what happened is, about a week ago, he went into this synagogue and started stabbing people. Now, what you're referring to in particular in this case is that when the police turned up, they did shoot him, but they also shot one of the synagogue goers.
Right, and so I bring that up not just. Right, and I bring that up not just to make fun of the UK police, although it is a fun pastime, but to say that the incentives as a law enforcement apparatus is not to do things like that, things that are dangerous and difficult and can put egg on your face. Well, why would you do that when you can fill your time showing up at normal patriotic Britain's doorstep saying, look what you posted about on X, show up in
Yeah.
court? There's no danger
Well,
there. Sorry, what was that?
Well, it is easier to sit in an office scrolling through Twitter than it is to deal with somebody who's trying to stab people.
No, certainly. So you mentioned before that this is not a phenomenon unique to your nation. It's sort of a global phenomenon. Do you want to provide some context there?
Yeah, can do. So I think you guys are safe from this at the moment. However, I strongly suspect that if your last election had gone a different way, that you would be getting bundled in with all of this stuff as well. What I'm referring to is what used to be called the UN 2030 plan. It's been rebranded since, and it's now called the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And as a part of that, they've got a whole bunch of these SDCs, these Sustainable Development Goals. And a big focus in this, and if anyone wants to, check my workings on this, go and have a look at the document. It's in section 16.9, is providing basically digital IDs to the world. And as they put it, and this is a direct quote from the document, digital ID is a prerequisite for access to services, finance, and mobility. So before you are allowed to access any government services, any finance or mobility, so your ability to move around, it's all going to be linked to a digital ID. And this has been rolled out in a whole bunch of countries. And I can talk in a minute about the countries that it's been rolled out in and, what they've been met with so far. But the other thing I'd say is it's not just a drive for digital IDs in itself. And that's when you've got to start looking at things like the Bank for International Settlements and the World Bank. And they've been very clear that this is a linked project to central bank digital currencies. And a digital ID is central to the design of a central bank digital currency, because if you wanted an anonymous, or at least a semi-anonymous one, one where every transaction wasn't tracked, it was in the blockchain or something, you've already got Bitcoin that serves that purpose. If you want a government to be able to see exactly what you're doing at all time, all transactions, you do need to have a central bank digital currency which is linked to a digital ID. And so they've been saying things like, it's let me see if I can dig out the quote. Oh yeah, so in the Bank of International Settlements Economic Report 2001, they said identity is central to design of central bank digital currencies, and they're very open on this stuff. A lot of people tend to not notice this stuff because it's very dry and skipped over. But all the press releases from the BIS and the World Bank make it very clear that this is what they're doing. They want a system where every single purchase that you make can be linked to your identity. Now, of course, it's only one step further than that to apply flags to this. So you can say, for example, as they do in China, this person is a dissident. This person should not be traveling. As they overtly say, it's all linked to finance and mobility. So if they decide that you are somebody who should not be traveling more than 15 minutes from your home, they can simply make it so that they know your home address, and any purchases made outside of that area will not go through and be denied at the point of purchase. They can also decide if they want to bring in eco stuff, limit the amount of carbon you're allowed to use, the amount of fuel, how many plane tickets you can buy, how much red meat you've consumed. This can all be activated and turned off. And again, people are going to say, okay, well, you're just reaching for dystopian solutions. This is happening only a few years after COVID, where they've actually already done stuff like this. In the UK, I don't know what the restrictions are like in the US to any great extent, but in the UK, for example, they decided that you weren't allowed to go to nightclubs. So they just shut them down. You weren't allowed to go to small family stores. You're allowed to go to big ones. You weren't allowed to go to small family stores. Church, that got shut down. And I don't think the US and the UK ever. I mean, it got pretty bad here, but at least it never got as bad as it did in, say, Australia or Canada. My understanding is that there are Canadian preachers who are still in jail for opening during COVID.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, one of them was just sentenced to just a few days ago And he had been held the entire time, right? I mean, sort of like a political prisoner. Uh, to your point, in the U.S., since we're so big and so variable, it really depended on where you were. I moved back to the town that I live in now because it was a place where COVID didn't really exist. I was able to, resume a normal life, and you put down roots. But I mean, even in cities like New Orleans, for example, which you would assume would be, riotous and crazy, if you were not, shall we say, a client group, Latoya Cantrell, no points for guessing where she's from, uh, basically shut down the whole city. Like you couldn't get in anywhere. And that was the one place where I had my very legitimate official signed by a doctor vax card. Like I've tried to sneak into a bar underage. Like someone checked it, said this is fake, and said get out, don't come back. That was the one place where it was like very, very strict, at least that I went. Obviously, others, DC, New York, California, particularly left wing areas, were very, very strict. But to say, like, you don't have to be that old to remember when these sort of controls were used, to
Yeah.
for these sort of dystopian ends.
Well, and once you've linked identity to payment system, I mean, the sky's the limit in terms of whatever your imagination can provide, whatever you want to restrict, whatever sort of powers you want over the population, you're going to have the ability to do them. So one of the first things you'll find is once we get digital ID, is that every other provider will want to use that, because if you've got an app or whatever it is, whatever service, why would you want to go to the bother and expense of verifying your user when you can just say, okay, well, we link to the ID that you got anyway? This has been the experience in Belgium. So they got one of the many countries that have got a digital ID system, and now even store loyalty cards won't activate unless they've been linked to the digital ID. So it ends up getting linked to it. So and of course it will get linked to your social media. And then, of course, it's very easy to say, okay, well, this person is tweeting something, and this no doubt be the British experience. You're tweeting something, and therefore it needs to be flagged, maybe not on the version that you can see, but certainly on the version that they can see, that this person is somebody with problematic views. And then it's only a small step to decide to restrict them in some way. At the very least, it would be, okay, well, the people that we don't like, the far right as they call us, which they tend to apply to something like 60% of the British population at this point, are complaining about whatever it is, lockdowns, or it might be the latest immigrant rape or stabbing, and they're planning to come to London for a protest. Well, that's problematic. We're going to turn off their ability to buy train tickets as they do in China, or we're going to turn off their ability to do something in order to, it will be framed as control. But really, it depends on whatever it is that you can imagine, they will be able to do it once they've got this sort of system in place, because they know exactly who you are, where you are, and every purchase that you make, and have the ability to simply turn it off if they don't want you doing that.
It's incredibly dystopian, especially when you consider, as we have seen in the US recently with this outbreak of political violence, that not only is the sliding scale of who is a Nazi very wide, but also the distance between, should we say, a minor censor, like, deplatform Nazis becomes punch Nazis, becomes shooting Nazis. And in the same way, right, the move from, you're kicked off of social media, to, there's an officer at your door, to, you can't do anything. You can't use the money you have worked for. You can't buy anything. Like we've seen that same slippery slope. And the slippery slope is it's called a fallacy, but it is simple pattern recognition. And we have multiple examples on both sides of the Atlantic, going back a scant 5 years, showing us exactly that if you give these people access to this sort of control, they will use it to ruin your life. Not everyone's life, but your life in particular. You, as an enemy of the state, as a non-client group, they're going to come for you. It's simply what they do. and they like it. They think it's fun. They think it's funny. And it is completely and totally unrelated to actually running a state in any sort of productive way. So I want to go back to CBDCs. I don't know very much about the economy. I don't know very much about money. What is functionally the additional layer of control added by CBDCs? Because it seems, from my relatively ignorant perspective, basically all money is digital anyway, and simply what this digital ID seems to be doing is coalescing information that already exists. And sure, it would take them more time, but if they really wanted to, the FBI could ring up. Actually, we see this all the time in the US with debanking. Check out my episode with Josh Moon, the founder of Kiwi Farms, to learn more about this. But they will simply say, you're a person of political risk, and so you can't have a bank account anymore. So to play devil's advocate here, basically what I'm asking is there really an additional level of control moving to the system, or is it just streamlining their ability to mess with you?
Yes, that is an important point. Let me address that on two fronts. First of all, the digital IDs, and then also on the central bank digital currencies. So one of the arguments that's been made is, okay, well, why are you worried about a digital ID when you already give so much information to Twitter and Netflix and Amazon and all the rest of it? The important thing to remember there is each of those is a one-to-one relationship, where I am the hub and the wheels of the spoke might be, yes, Google and Amazon and whoever else that has a lot of data on me. But each of those is a one-to-one relationship. With a digital ID, that becomes the hub, and everything else becomes a spoke around it, including yourself. So there is a single point at which permissions can be granted or denied. Whereas if, let's say, what has happened to Carl here at the Lotus Eaters, he was taken off Patreon a few years back. Well, at least Patreon had to make that decision. And then, he was demonetized from YouTube. At least YouTube had to make that decision. And each point around it, they had to make their own, they had to commit focus and attention to doing something. Whereas if the digital ID sits at the center of this and a flag is applied at that level, well, it affects everything simultaneously. So then take that to something like central banks, central bank digital currencies and your bank situation. Yes, you can be debanked. Of course you can. But at the moment, there is at least the level of friction that if your or my government wants to debank us, they then have to get a court order and apply it to that bank. And then any other banks that you have. And if they want to disable your spouse's account, they need, it's friction. And they can, if they really want to go for you, they can do that. But it is friction, and it's not easy for them to do that. When everything is centralized, it becomes incredibly easy to turn you off, and you won't be able to find a way around it. So at least with the Canadian truckers is, yes, a lot of them did get their banks turned off, but they could find other banks, or they could find these modern banks like Revolut, or the Cash App things. They could find ways around it. You can't do that if it comes down to a central hub, because they have the ability to turn it all off at once. Now, on the point of central bank digital currencies and how do they work, it is fundamentally different, because at the moment, the central banks in both our countries sits as a sort of regulator and lender of last resort, and does a few other bits in the banking system. But you have your money with each various bank, and they talk to each other, and they aggregate up as to who owes what at the end of the day, and they net it all out and the whole thing. With a central bank digital currency, you don't have money at a bank anymore. The bank is redundant in this situation, although they've been looking at ways that they can include them so that they don't become an obstacle in order for its rollout. All of the money is held at the central bank, all of it. So you will just simply be flagged on, however many dollars or however many pounds, but this is tied to your account. That's not your money. It's very much the central bank's money, and it's theirs to do with it as they wish. And again, if you tie it back to a digital ID, you can well imagine getting to the point where they decide that their friends get more favourable financial conditions than their enemies. And they probably wouldn't frame this as, okay, white men from now on are going to pay higher taxes. What they would do is they would set a high tax rate, and then they would start going around and saying, okay, well, you're disadvantaged, so you get a lower tax rate. You're from a marginalized group, so you get a more favorable interest rate. You can apply monetary and fiscal policy at the individual level. And clearly that will be used for friends and enemies, just like, as you said, absolutely everything else is.
Well, exactly. And we already see this with grants, free money from the government. If you start a small business, and this is a large part of the reason that hotels and gas stations have been taken over by foreign interest cartels from the subcontinent, is that they qualify for extremely favorable small business loans. The kind that, Dan, if you and I started a gas station together, we wouldn't qualify for because of certain reasons. That already exists. And similarly, and like I said, I don't know anything about money or the economy. To me, it also gives the central bank a lot more tools if they can expand or contract the money supply whenever they want, like down to a moment. Because it would be very easy to have effectively a true floating dollar. So you wake up one day, your bank account says you have 20 grand. The next day it says you have 15 grand or 25, right? A constant adjusting of, I'm sure, very, very studiously applied, right, standards. And look, like I put that out to play devil's advocate. I've heard that argument. I don't necessarily buy it. I don't buy it at all. Because not only do you have the function of reducing friction, and we understand that like the friction doesn't stop them from doing something, but it makes it much, much harder. For instance, in the US, there's a reason that if you're going to do something sketchy or illegal or against the interest of the regime, you do that either in person or over the phone, because the rules for phone tapping are much, much more stringent than it is for a messaging app or something on social media. Now, look, that doesn't mean that the FBI hasn't caught someone talking on a phone before, right? Phone taps exist. We've seen this happen to Trump, but also to mobsters. But it's harder to do. They are much less likely to divert those sort of resources to a nobody. Whereas if it is incredibly easy, if they just have it out there, or even they have all the information and AI is trolling for people who meet certain criteria, which, look, man, like you could do that with Microsoft Excel, let alone the sort of the data and access that they are angling for. Of course this is going to be used, as you've said, to enforce friends and enemies. I'm going to be honest, I hadn't even considered the political weaponization when it comes to taxes, because taxes in the US, it's a very bizarre, opaque system. I understand it doesn't quite work the same way in the UK, where they just take your taxes, where in our case, there's this whole elaborate system of preparing your own tax returns, which sort of functions as a sort of Damocles over everybody's head. As you saw with Trump, if they go back, they can find something you or someone you paid probably did wrong, and they will use that to ruin your life. Whereas now they will have, from their perspective, a perfect check, right? They will know exactly what you owe instead of being audited. And so again, that serves as a way to enforce a friend-enemy distinction. You misreported income on your tax forms is very easy to do, even legitimately. Well, we don't like you, so we're going to use that as the stick to beat you. That already happens. We've already seen the Obama administration do that to the Tea Party and conservative groups, and that was with a relatively small amount of information, right? A relatively small amount of, describing 2012 as a small amount of control over the finance industry is kind of wild, but on the sliding scale that includes the things that we're talking about, it is technically true. Again, it's absurd to believe that this will, this is merely fear mongering. So sorry, big rant there, Dan.
Can I quickly pick up on one point that you said there? Of
course.
You talked about sort of making the money expirable. I mean, that is absolutely something I'd want to do. And I can give you a good example of that. So during COVID, your government decided to hand out stimulus checks out to people. And what happened when they did that? Bitcoin went through the roof, because everybody was just like, okay, well, I'm going to buy some Bitcoin with it then, because obviously if they got to the point where they're printing money in order to just dole it out to people, maybe I'll need an alternative. And that's, from the government's point of view, that's not what they were trying to do. And also, it was a very messy and it was a very complicated exercise in trying to get those stimulus checks out to everybody. So from their point of view, a central bank digital currency would be a wonderful tool on this, because it's linked to the ID. So you know exactly who's supposed to get it. But then furthermore, because it's linked through this system, you can then say, okay, well, I'm not going to allow you to go and buy Bitcoin or whatever it is, get an upgrade for your car. This has to be spent on consumption. And also, because it's a stimulus, the whole point of a stimulus is that we want you to go out there and spend it now. We're not try and do any of that horrible saving stuff. So it'd be very easy to make it expire after 30 days if you haven't used it on consumption of some sort. And you can well imagine a COVID-like scenario where they do this for the first time, and they're like, oh, that really worked. We were able to get money out to people. We managed to force them to do some consumption with it, which is exactly the type of spending they like. Governments love it when people consume. They don't love it when they spend or when they save or invest for the long term. That's the worst kind of spending from their point of view. But consumption in the now. And you can imagine it won't be that long before they go, well, maybe we should make it all like this. Maybe your wages should be paid in at the beginning of the month and should have a 30-day expiry on it, so you can consume until your next paycheck, and then if you haven't used it by then, it's gone. Basically anything that you can imagine, they will be able to apply, and with each of them, there's a historic example of where they tried to do that thing, only they didn't have the tools to do it at that time.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up. There's this term, and look, it's been a while since I was in business school, but the velocity of money, right? How often a hypothetical dollar is changing hands. Look, everyone knows that, like, the MBA brain, the type of person who's gone to the right universities, they love that number as high as it can get. And we already see the contorted knots that our regulators tie themselves in to maximize GDP, right? All the stupid things they'll do to lie. Like, for instance, you see this in the US with the way we talk about inflation, right? Obviously, when you adjust for GDP, you take the raw inflation number out. Not super technical, don't need to get into it. And so if you can artificially adjust inflation down, you can create a perception of higher GDP. And that's the thing we want. That's the number that needs to be big. And so in the US, what you've seen is the basket of goods, the CPI, Consumer Price Index, where they basically collect a couple things and say, this is the cost of living. We can see it grow or decrease. Well, it's been changed 18 times in the last 30 years, basically, more than every 2 years. And that is simply to maximize a variable. We need to see this number going up, the nonsense we do to achieve that goal. And so the idea is, look, if they're already willing to throw everything out the window to maximize certain values, you think if you gave them this, all of these different buttons and levers to pull, it's like one of those fidget toys for autistic children where it's gotten like all these different things you can do. Like, you think they won't do that? Because I've seen what they did with the most boring, stodgy math formulas designed in the 1950s. The shenanigans they got up to. It's absurd to believe that they'll suddenly start being responsible.
Quickly on the inflation thing, because that is a brilliant example. So, I've looked, and our data quants have done the same thing. But no, some of your examples of how they calculate inflation are quite breathtaking. So, for one, the original basket contained things like steak. And then the price of steak kept on going up. So what they said is, okay, well, because steak is expensive now, people are going to buy less steak and they're more likely to buy burgers or something, or maybe lamb or tofu or some alternative. So they substituted out the steak and put in the tofu or the burgers or whatever. And then they can say, okay, well, look, the price of those things is not as much as the steak. And therefore, even though steak has gone up, this is actually a decrease in inflation. And probably the best example that was in the US numbers is they added an iPhone at some point, back when an iPhone was something like $800. And I don't use iPhones, but my understanding is at least twice that now. And that actually went in your numbers as a cost reduction. going from 800 to 1600 or whatever it is. And the way that they got there was said, okay, well, the 1600 phone has 4 times the features of the 800 phone. So even though the price has doubled, is actually halved in cost. So, I mean, some of the bullshit that they spin is, I mean, it's quite epic. Impressive, actually.
Right. And look, like, that's kind of comedic, and that isn't necessarily as sinister, right? No one is being turned away from a gas station over the fact that the CPI has been messed with. But it's to say you can't trust these people. Very clearly, you can't trust these people, because even in something that is relatively inconsequential, it is effectively a measurement. They're lying about the measurements. If you went to if you went to a gas station, we use that example, and the sticker that says this this machine has been checked by the board that certifies it's measuring fairly, was written in crayon, right? It was very clearly not legitimate. You would start to get a little bit suspicious. And if you said, well, how about we hand the guy who runs a shady gas station, with pumps that are, unfair, let's give him ultimate power to decide about everyone's money and all personal freedoms. That would be stupid, right? That would clearly be a bad idea. And look, I feel like this doesn't even need to be said, because we've seen the conclusions of the experts, right? The expert class in both our countries has so thoroughly discredited themselves. I mean, obviously, COVID is a very relevant example. You may remember when, during the summer of Floyd, it was determined that protesting for racial justice would not be a super spreader event, while going to church would be. And look, I'm no virologist, but that seems kind of dumb to me. And so the idea that
enemies.
Exactly, yes, which is what we keep coming back to, that this will be used as a stick to beat their opposition into submission. So I want to go back to this what's the term? The public outcry, right? You have this petition, thank you, that people have signed. What has been the reaction on the ground to digital IDs? Obviously, many people, myself included, have been freaked out about this. I know in the US, there's a religious objection to digital IDs, particularly in more charismatic faiths. So how do normal people feel about this?
I can perhaps best describe that from a comment that a journalist overheard at the recent Labour Party conference, where one MP was overheard saying, I hate knocking on doors these days, because the moment they see a red rosette, they scream fuck off and slam the door in our face. So, I mean, but I mean, that is liberating for Starmer, because if you are so unpopular that you're never going to win an election again, I mean, I've often talked about what I would do to fix this country. And I would have to address some of the deep problems that we've got with pensions and welfare and NHS. And I could put this country's finances back on track very quickly. What I could not do is get elected in order to do those things, because the NHS is basically a religion over here, and it can't be touched, even though I think it's disastrous. I think there's a better way of doing it. Again, pensions, you can't, boomers vote. They're not going to vote for, changing the pension system. Everybody on welfare gets a vote. Again, they're not. So you see the problem that I would have in trying to get elected with this stuff. But because Starmer is never going to need to worry about being in government ever again, he's just got these 4 years. There's really no reason for him to hold back on basically anything.
Well, right. It's damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. The ship is already sinking from his perspective. So why not? You see the similar thing in the US with lame duck presidents. So, for instance, Joe Biden, when he's out, the election is done. What does he do? All kinds of stupid stuff. He just writes all these pardons, does all the sort of things that, if you were actually worried about, your electoral prospects, would make you look very dumb. But it doesn't matter. He's out, so you've got a definite amount of time to use your power. And yeah, I mean, that's what's been so. The phrase "mask off" moment is sort of redundant and overused, but it has been kind of frightening, right? Both with the reaction to the Southport riots, the crackdown on speech, and now this. I mean, it genuinely seems as if they not only hate the people that make up their country, but they're really not particularly concerned about hiding that fact anymore.
And I do suspect that this could well have come to your country if there had been a different outcome at the last election. Because I mean, I do want to make the point that it's not just something that is happening currently in England. It popped out of seemingly nowhere, and I know that our commentators are more likely to speak to each other than perhaps Swedish and US commentators are likely to do so. I mean, I could very quickly skim through some of the other countries where this has already been rolled out. It is a larger scheme. It's not just China. So India rolled out a version recently, and that was disastrous because it's again linked to their welfare system. And the old welfare system used to basically be you had a local official would hand out a bag of rice to people who might starve. Obviously, being India, loads of corruption in that. They decided to link it to this digital ID. And now every time there's errors, you get whole regions of India starving. And there have been many tens of thousands of death links to this because of admin errors. Estonia is a good example. Estonia, for whatever reason, is a good test bed for globalist projects. They get a lot of this stuff first. 750,000 of their citizens got locked out of banking. They decided that wasn't viable. I mean, China, we all know, but basically all the dystopian stuff that we talked about, they're already doing it. Denmark. Lots of citizens locked out of banking and healthcare. Every time there's an error, some admin error with the system, you can't access a hospital, you can't access your bank. And what do you do then? Because absolutely everything is linked to it. Singapore, they had to rework the system thoroughly recently because of hacks. Again, you're creating a giant honeypot of this data, very valuable. Interestingly, actually, China is rolling back on the data that they're collecting. And the reason they're doing that is because they realize it's a massive data honeypot. And if a bad actor gets hold of it, that's your national security severely compromised. So while China is rolling back, other countries are adding it on. Belgium, I talked about, is creeped into everything. So now even store loyalty cards demand it. Sweden is another example. In Sweden, they're playing this friend's enemy thing very well. And basically, the left has worked out that all you need to do is flag to a bank that Swede over there is a nationalist Swede. He's for Sweden, for the Swedish, and the bank will debank him. So they just spend all their time going around saying, okay, well that guy's a bit right wing, that guy's a bit right wing, knowing that will get them debanked. I just mentioned a couple more, but Ukraine, this got pushed through when they fell under the heel of the globalists. And Ethiopia is an interesting one because they're doing it all through ethnic profiling, through biometrics. Now, you've got to remember, Ethiopia is not that far removed from Rwanda. This is a region of the world where inter-ethnic conflicts can be a bit lively. And they're basing their digital ID system around this. I mean, and there are many other examples I could give you. The point I'm really making is that the globalist institutions, everything from the UN to Davos to Bank for International Settlements, World Bank, a whole bunch of them, they've decided that they want this and they are rolling it out everywhere that they can. And actually, the interesting thing is, why has it not been put out in certain places rather than why is it being put out in the places it is being put out on?
No, certainly there's something to that. One of the other things I can't stop thinking about is the genuinely Orwellian number of security cameras in your country.
Yes.
Look, we understand AI and the AI revolution is, there's a certain perspective from which it's kind of fake. Like as a market development, there's an argument to be made there. But very clearly, we've seen the advancements in technology around facial recognition, even well before the advent of consumer AI. This is a very, very frightening mix. The ability to track anyone on an economic level, right? Where did your number scan in? You combine that with a countrywide mesh of security cameras. And look, as an example, I can't remember the exact terminology, but I know Sadiq Khan has pushed these sort of like green congestion zone traffic cameras in the center of London. Again, using the combination of, fair enough, a number plate, but let's be honest, from a computer's perspective, a number plate and an individually recognizable face, not that big of a difference, right? to fence people and to fence certain activities, to say, no, you either need to pay or you're not allowed to be in a certain area at a certain time. Like, clearly, we've seen how this system meshed with a surveillance state creates this kind of like horrific Orwellian results. And that assumes that the system works perfectly. As you said, I get software errors all the time. Look, I was almost late to this episode because my internet went down for no reason. And look, like, okay, sure, if I'm late, that is embarrassing and it kind of makes me a little annoyed. But okay, no big deal. No one dies. Whereas if I have this software error and I've just had my leg amputated, I'm gushing blood, this becomes a much bigger issue. Clearly, as you've seen in the examples from those countries you just mentioned.
And I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, I left venture capital about 6 years ago, but one of the companies I saw there was a company that did exactly what you were talking about. So they were offering services where they put cameras in stores, and they would scan the faces of everybody who came in, and then they'd figure out when you went to pay who you were, and they'd build a profile around you. And then the next time that person came into the store, you could get a heads up that, okay, that's a good customer, or that's a time waste, or whatever it is. So, and this was being rolled out at retail level. Whatever version the government has is obviously going to be quite a bit more advanced than that. And they are going to want to do it. And you talk about policing, but you've got to understand that once you have this sort of system in place, you don't actually need to do much policing, because if you can identify everybody and then you can just turn off their money, that is going to basically keep in line most people. The people it's not going to keep in line are the people who, let's be sensitive to US demographics. People who have very low impulse control, and the prospect of ending up in jail is not
high
something
time preference individuals. I think we can
yes,
say.
That's what I'm looking for. Yes, those people, that they are not going to be thinking ahead to next week when they might find that their ability to make a purchase gets affected in some way. They find it very difficult to control their impulse in the here and now. But if you've built a system where 98% of the population basically don't need policing because it's too onerous to go against the system, and you get cancelled from everything, then those people are just going to be left to run riot, because your police, and all they do now is check in with people who expose themselves as an enemy of the system in some way.
Oh, certainly. And I mean, we've already seen that, going back to the conversation about policing earlier. The ability of the police to actually enact violence when needed is atrophied when these people spend all of their time doing stupid stuff that doesn't matter. Clearly. And look, like, I'm not some bootlicker, I'm not some big, like, back the blue guy, but police serves a useful purpose, right? There's a reason that that's something civilized societies tend to have. So look, we're fast coming up on time, Dan. I appreciate you coming on. Is there any hope in this, right? Where do you see, if there any, light at the end of the tunnel? I know this has been a depressing episode, as ours often are, but can you offer any sort of silver lining to this cloud to the audience?
If I may, I'll make 2 points. First of all, I do actually acknowledge that in the world that we live in, there is a case to be made for having digital ID, the ability to be able to verify who you are when you go online. However, and I won't spend long on this, but for those who are interested in that, there is a technology called zero knowledge proofs, which is effectively a digital ID, but the difference is that you retain all of your data, but you can verify yourself online. And this feels like an attempt to get ahead of that, because that is technology that is almost game ready, and people will start to adopt for themselves. So they kind of want to get in there ahead and say, no, we need the state version, we need the centrally controlled version. And on your point of, do I see any optimism in this? The most optimistic thing that I can say is that every time the UK government has tried to roll out an IT scheme, it has been so bloated, so ineffectual, so inefficient, that it always ends up taking 3 times as long and costing 10 times as much. So probably the best that we can hope for is that even though they intend to bring it in before Labour leaves office, but they are simply too incompetent to do so, or ends up costing too much. And I really think that's probably our best bet. If we can delay this, we can probably kill it.
Well, and I mean, that's a valid point. You're even talking about COVID IDs in the US. Not only was that sort of squashed, I have a very distinct memory of wondering if I was ever going to be able to have a job during, the COVID pandemic because of comments made by the administration. But what happened was nothing ever worked as well as it was supposed to. So, you have a physical card. And, the physical card is supposed to have all of these anti-tampering measures. That didn't happen. Well, technically, if you have it and you're applying for a government job where you need it, then they might catch you. It was the very degraded version of what you could tell they wanted. They were so incompetent that they couldn't get it across the line, so to speak. And I realize, betting on the incompetence of your enemies is not a great strategy, but the track record's pretty good that they are unable to do, what they want to. So Dan, again, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you and your work?
Well, I am one of the presenters at a podcast of the Lotus Eaters. I have a show called Brokenomics, which is my own thing where I get to go in depth on broken economic and political systems. The last episode, and that's normally premium, it's normally behind the paywall, but the last episode I did on digital IDs, and that was released on our website yesterday, and that one has been made freemium. So anybody who wants to go into the depth where I basically, everything that we talked about here today, I just go into much more depth in that episode. Anyone who wants to watch that can watch that episode for free, or you can catch our podcast daily at 1 p.m. UK time every work day.
We'll definitely highly endorse your work. Be sure to check it out at the links down in the description. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Look, this is my full-time job. If you want to support me doing it, you're going to have to throw me a few bucks, which you can do on Gumroad, Substack, or Patreon. In exchange, you get the episodes early and ad-free. So you support me, you get something for it. If you're interested in our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness Coaching, please check it out. Launched a new program there. Click the link, 2 weeks of free custom programming. JD is one of our guys, and he's been supporting me for years. So be sure to check that out. Again, Dan, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.